He stood in silence as the courtroom roared against him. Not a word, not a protest, just a quiet stare that pierced deeper than any defense. Seconds later, the gavel fell, and so did the silence. What this man revealed next wouldn't just change his fate, it would uncover a secret buried for decades. He didn't speak as the court filled with murmurs and the rustle of legal documents. He simply sat still, composed, as though every whisper around him was just wind. The man at the center of the hearing wasn't handcuffed, wasn't flanked by guards, and didn't carry the air of someone caught in the grip of scandal. Yet the energy in the room betrayed something different, something tense, something electric. The bailiff called for order, and yet the room never truly settled. There was a quiet weight to the morning, the kind that hangs in the air when something important is about to unfold, like the moment before a storm, where the sky turns still and the air forgets how to breathe. At the defense table sat Micah Ellison, 64, former Navy chaplain, pastor, widower, a man whose greatest crime, according to the sheet filed with the court, was unauthorized congregation on federal grounds, a phrase that sounded official enough to hide the truth. He had prayed, quietly, respectfully, and someone, somewhere, decided it was disruptive. To those who knew Micah, this hearing wasn't just unnecessary, it was insulting. He was known for compassion, for calm, for helping people others ignored. The kind of man who would carry groceries for strangers, or sit silently with grieving families long after others had left. Yet here he was, in a courtroom that felt more like a trap than a hall of justice. The judge had not yet entered, but everyone knew who would preside over the hearing. Judge Marion Rourke, firm, disciplined, and feared not for her rulings, but for her demeanor. She wasn't known for raised voices or harsh tones. She didn't need them. Her authority came in stares, in silence, in the cold precision with which she ran her courtroom. People said she could quiet a room just by turning her head. And today, her gaze would fall on Pastor Micah. His attorney, Ava Morgan, was half his age but twice as nervous. This was only her third appearance before Judge Rourke. The first had ended with a warning, the second with a dismissal. She knew the judge's reputation, but she had taken Micah's case anyway. Not because she needed the publicity she avoided. Not because she thought it would be easy, it wasn't. She took the case because the moment she met Micah, she felt something rare. Conviction. Micah hadn't defended himself. He hadn't complained. He simply asked her if she believed in what was right. That was all. No pressure, no speeches, just a question, and she couldn't forget it. She looked at him now, sitting with his hands folded neatly on the table, eyes calm, breathing steady. He wasn't afraid. That unsettled her more than fear would have. It meant he knew something important, something no one else in the room seemed to see yet. In the back row of the courtroom, a man in a charcoal suit sat with his legs crossed and a leather satchel beside him. He didn't look like he belonged in the crowd. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't looked up once since he sat down, but he was watching more closely than anyone knew. His name was Thomas Gray, and although most people in the room didn't know who he was, they would, soon, because Thomas wasn't there for Micah. He was there for the judge. At exactly 10:02 a.m., the courtroom doors opened and silence rippled through the space. Judge Rourke entered without a word, her black robes brushing against polished wood, her eyes scanning the room like a lighthouse in search of stormy waters. All rise. The bailiff intoned. Everyone stood. Micah rose last. It wasn't defiance. It was intention. He didn't move quickly or slowly. He moved like someone who had spent years learning how to be still in chaos. Someone who knew that dignity, once it was truly chosen, couldn't be shaken by noise or fear. The judge nodded for everyone to sit. Papers shuffled. The echo of wooden benches faded. "We are here to address the matter of Micah Ellison," Judge Rourke began, her voice smooth but clipped, charged with repeated unauthorized use of federal property for personal religious activities. "Mr. Ellison, are you aware of the nature of this hearing?" Micah met her eyes. "I am. And do you understand the consequences of your actions?" A pause. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly, "but I believe the greater consequences come from inaction." Ava glanced at him. That wasn't what they rehearsed, but the words didn't feel wrong. They felt necessary. The judge blinked once, slowly. "This is not a place for sermons, Mr. Ellison." He didn't smile, but there was something behind his eyes, a steadiness that made even the most hardened legal clerks shift slightly in their seats. "I understand. And do you intend to plead guilty, or not guilty to the charges presented. Micah didn't answer right away. From the back of the room, Thomas Gray uncrossed his legs. Then, Micah said, "Neither." Gasps flickered through the courtroom like sparks trying to catch fire. The judge's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly around her pen. "That's not an option, Mr. Ellison." Micah turned slightly, just enough to glance back toward the man in the back row. Their eyes met. Then he returned his gaze to the bench. "With respect, Your Honor, I didn't come to plead. I came to reveal." Another ripple moved through the room, small but unmistakable. Judge Rourke leaned forward. "This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Ellison, not a stage." Micah didn't flinch. Double quotes, "No ma'am, it's a mirror." And just like that, the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Outside, the wind stirred. Inside, no one moved. What did he mean by reveal? What mirror? Ava's heart thudded in her chest. She had no idea what he was doing, but something told her he did. He wasn't there to argue the law. He wasn't even there to defend himself. He was waiting for something bigger than the courtroom, bigger than the judge, bigger than all of them. And in that silence, something shifted, because sometimes the loudest voice is the one that doesn't raise itself at all. Sometimes truth waits, and when it speaks, it doesn't shout, it echoes. The silence didn't leave the room. It lingered, thick and stubborn, like fog refusing to lift. Judge Rourke's gaze stayed locked on Micah, her pen motionless in her hand, the air between them unmoving. In all her years on the bench, she had never heard someone say they weren't pleading. She had heard confessions, excuses, deflections, never what he had just said. "I came to reveal." The words repeated themselves like a drumbeat in her mind, and though she wouldn't admit it, something about them unsettled her, not because they were loud, but because they were true. She sat back in her chair slowly. "You will speak only when asked to," she said firmly. "This is a hearing, not a confessional." Micah didn't respond, not out of rebellion but restraint. He was calm, almost still, as if the courtroom noise no longer reached him. The tension that hovered wasn't coming from him. It was coming from what he carried, and even though no one knew exactly what it was, everyone could feel it coming. From her seat, Ava Morgan looked down at her notes, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't how the case was supposed to unfold. She had prepared arguments, researched case law, drafted statements, but none of that seemed to matter now. Micah was on a path of his own, and she didn't know where it led. She only knew one thing for sure. He wasn't afraid. In the gallery, Thomas Gray finally leaned forward. It was subtle, barely a shift, but it was enough to signal that the waiting was over. He placed his leather satchel on his lap and carefully unzipped it. No one noticed. Not yet. The judge cleared her throat. "Miss Morgan," she said, "I assume you've advised your client of courtroom decorum." Ava stood, her voice slightly uncertain. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then perhaps you can explain what exactly he intends to reveal. Because unless it pertains directly to the charges, this court has no interest in dramatic declarations." Ava opened her mouth, but Micah gently raised his hand. "With your permission," he said, his voice quiet but composed, "I'd like to submit something into the record." Judge Rourke narrowed her eyes. "You are not a licensed attorney, Mr. Ellison." "No, ma, but I believe this document was prepared by someone who is—" There was a rustle behind Ava as Thomas Gray rose from his seat and made his way down the aisle. For a moment, no one stopped him. He wasn't dressed like a protester. He didn't speak. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged. And in that moment, no one thought to challenge him. He approached the front table and handed Ava a single manila folder. "Who are you?" the bailiff asked sharply, stepping forward. Thomas didn't look at him. His eyes remained on the judge. "Thomas Gray, Federal Ethics Division. This folder contains documents regarding sealed judicial correspondences, internal investigations, and transcripts related to multiple rulings passed by this court. I believe Mr. Ellison's case intersects with more than just a charge of trespassing." The judge's face stiffened. "What are you implying?" she asked. Thomas remained still. "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm confirming it." Ava opened the folder slowly. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the first few pages. Her breath caught. It wasn't one file, it was dozens. Emails, memos, timestamps, legal drafts, each with a different header. But they all had one name in common. Judge Marion Rourke. She looked up, startled. "Your Honor, this is ... I'm aware of what it is, the judge snapped, her voice taut. But even as she said it, something in her voice cracked, not loudly, not fully, but enough for anyone really listening to hear. It was the sound of a wall beginning to shift under its own weight. Micah sat quietly. He hadn't moved since the folder was handed over. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. He just waited. Judge Rourke stood. This hearing is now recessed for review. No, ma'am, Micah interrupted, gently. With all due respect, the hearing hasn't even started yet. The room stilled again. Micah stood, slowly, reverently. He wasn't challenging the judge. He was honoring something older than law. For 27 years, he said, his voice steady and rich with quiet power. You've passed judgment on the lives of people who never stood a chance, not because of the law, but because they didn't look like you, speak like you, come from where you come from. The bailiff stepped forward. Sir Micah raised one hand. I won't raise my voice. I won't insult anyone. I will only tell the truth. Judge Rourke said nothing. Micah stepped forward. 3 months ago, I stood on the steps of a federal building and prayed. No signs, no crowd, just prayer. I prayed for a city broken by silence, and for a justice system that had forgotten how to listen. His voice softened even more, and someone called it a disturbance. A few in the gallery lowered their eyes. I didn't come here today to clear my name, he continued. I came because the people you silenced year after year, name after name, don't have rooms like this to speak in, but I do, and I will. Ava's hand moved slowly to her heart. The courtroom was no longer just a courtroom. It was a confessional, a reckoning. Micah took a deep breath. I served in 2 wars. I've buried children I never met. I've counseled families torn apart by systems that didn't see them. But today, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for accountability. He looked directly at the judge. I'm asking if the law is still a place where truth belongs. The clock ticked once, twice. Judge Rourke sat back down, her face unreadable. Micah folded his hands again. He had said what needed to be said, not to destroy, but to awaken. And in that moment, no one in the courtroom cared about the charge anymore. No one was thinking about a man praying on the steps of a building. They were thinking about how easily justice forgets its purpose when no one dares to remind it. And Micah Ellison had dared. The room didn't erupt. It didn't break. It just breathed for the first time in a very long while. And somewhere in that quiet, the walls began to shift. The courtroom sat in stunned stillness, not because someone had been silenced, but because for the first time, someone had finally been heard. Judge Rourke's gavel sat untouched. Her fingers rested beside it, unmoving. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. The silence wasn't hers anymore. Micah Ellison stood, as if time had slowed just for him. His posture, gentle but unshakable, told a story that had nothing to do with defense or defiance. It was something deeper, like the weight of a promise he had made to someone long ago, and finally had the strength to keep. His voice didn't need volume. It carried something far more powerful. History. Somewhere in the back row, a woman named Evelyn Drew wiped a quiet tear from her cheek. She hadn't planned on attending. She hadn't even meant to step into the building, but something told her she needed to be there that day. Years ago, her younger brother had been arrested for standing outside a city library holding a sign that read, "I belong." The charges never made sense, but the silence that followed them was deafening. Micah's voice stirred something in her, something buried, a memory of her brother's voice trembling on the phone, saying, "They don't want my words. They want me to disappear." That memory, long hidden beneath routine and resignation, now sat fully awake inside her. She didn't know Micah, but in that moment, she felt like he was speaking for her too. Thomas Gray, still standing near the bench, watched the judge with a stillness equal to Micah's. He had spent 12 years in federal compliance, most of them filled with reports that no one read, complaints that went unanswered, and files stamped inconclusive. He wasn't just there to expose paperwork. He was there to witness someone finally bringing light into the places where too many shadows had lived unchallenged. The judge slowly flipped through the folder. Her eyes scanned page after page, and something behind them began to shift. She wasn't a woman easily rattled. Her career was built on order, control, and carefully calculated neutrality. But Micah's words, and more importantly the truth inside them, cracked something she thought was permanent. The law, she had once believed, was a place where emotion had no seat. But what if that was the very problem? The clerk cleared his throat quietly, unsure if the judge wanted to proceed. She didn't respond. Not immediately. Ava Morgan's hands were clenched on the table in front of her, but she wasn't nervous anymore. She felt something coursing through her, something like fire but clearer. When she had taken Micah's case, friends had warned her, "Be careful, this won't end in a victory." But standing beside him now, she realized this wasn't about winning. It never had been. It was about remembering why the law existed, who it was for, and what it must protect. Micah looked down at his hands, scarred from years of labor, prayer, and service. Every mark had a memory. The knuckles split during Hurricane Josiah, when he helped lift a collapsed beam off a trapped teenager. The burn from boiling water, spilled during a church food drive when he didn't notice the pot tipping. The thin scar near his wrist, from patching up a man who had wandered into his church bleeding and afraid. His hands didn't carry violence, they carried proof of what quiet service looked like. He looked back up. "Judge Rourke," he said gently, "I know what you're thinking, that this isn't how the system works, that there's a process for every motion, a timeline for every truth. But when the system only hears certain voices, when it values rules over justice, it becomes deaf to the people it claims to serve." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in realization. "I didn't come to challenge your seat," Micah continued. "I came to remind the room why it exists, so that one day someone else doesn't have to." The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man in a gray suit stepped inside, quietly handing a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who took it with a nod. The envelope bore the stamp of the Department of Justice. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Thomas Gray had ensured that the bailiff brought the envelope forward, placing it in front of the judge. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she looked at Micah again, this time, truly looked at him, not as a defendant, not as a number, but as a man. "You believe this document changes everything?" she asked Thomas. He answered without hesitation, "I believe it confirms what he said, but he's already changed everything." For a long time, the judge said nothing. Then she looked at Ava "young lady." She said, "Have you ever lost a case that still changed the law?" Ava blinked. "Not yet, Your Honor. You might not win this one either," the judge said softly. "But the law may never see this courtroom the same way again." The gallery was still. Then, one by one, people began to stand, not in protest, not in outrage, but in respect. An elderly man near the back, who had been silent the whole time, placed his hat over his heart. A young student who had wandered in by mistake sat straighter, no longer looking at her phone. Even the court reporter's fingers paused on the keys, catching her breath between strokes. And Micah, he simply bowed his head, as if in prayer, not for mercy, but for clarity, as if giving thanks not for the verdict to come, but for the moment that had just passed. A moment where, for once, truth had not been shouted. It had been honored. It wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something bigger. The sound that followed was not silence, it was awareness, a kind of breathless waiting that stretched between heartbeats. Every soul in that courtroom felt it. They weren't waiting for a gavel to strike. They were waiting for something deeper. Truth had entered the room, and now everyone was holding their breath to see what it would do next. Micah sat back down, quietly, without fanfare, but the shift was visible. He didn't sit like a man accused. He sat like a man whose mission had reached the heart of its storm. Even Judge Rourke didn't look at him the same. She glanced down at the unopened envelope on her desk, the one stamped by the Department of Justice, and tapped her finger against it like she was testing the weight of an unseen truth. It was Ava who broke the stillness, not with a voice raised in defense, but with a question. "Your Honor," she said softly, "before we move forward, may I call one more witness?" Judge Rourke blinked. "You've already submitted your list, Ms. Morgan." "I know, but this name, it wasn't on that list because he wasn't ready, until now." The judge studied her, then gave a small nod. "Proceed." From the back of the courtroom, a man stood. He was older, maybe in his 70s, his posture bent with time, but his eyes sharp, focused, the kind of eyes that had watched too much history unfold from the sidelines. He walked with a quiet dignity, like he was stepping onto ground he had once been denied but never forgotten. His name was Elijah Brooks. For most of his life, Elijah had been a schoolteacher in the South, not a famous activist, not a politician, just a man who taught history to children who were never taught their own. He had seen Micah once, years ago, on the steps of a chapel. During a peace vigil, he never forgot him, and when he read about the charges, something inside him stirred. Ava looked at the judge. Mr. Brooks has sworn testimony regarding the origins of this arrest, how it came to be, and more importantly, why. Elijah took the stand and settled into the chair. His voice wasn't strong, but it was sure. Back in the spring, he began. I watched Micah Ellison stand outside a federal building, not shouting, not blocking doors, just praying. I watched officers ask him to move, and he did. I watched them return, again and again, each time with more pressure. But I also watched something else. I watched others gather not to protest, but to be still, to listen. And the more they listened, the more peaceful they became. He paused. That peace scared someone, not because it was dangerous, but because it was effective. Judge Rourke tilted her head slightly. And you believe that led to the charges? I don't believe, Elijah said. I know. I was there when a city official called a meeting and said, this man is stirring too much attention. If we don't act now, we'll lose control of the narrative. That's what this is about. Not disruption, not disobedience, but fear of influence. Gasps whispered through the gallery. Even Ava hadn't heard this part before. Thomas Gray shifted. Near the prosecution's table, pulling a file from his briefcase, he walked forward and laid it in front of the judge. This is a record of internal communications between municipal officers and federal departments, he said. Mr. Brooks' account is consistent with the documents inside. Judge Rourke didn't reach for the file immediately. Instead, she looked at Elijah. You said peace scared someone. Why? Elijah folded his hands. Because when people find peace, they stop being easy to control. The judge sat back, hands clasped tightly. Micah met her gaze, not with challenge, but with patience. For a moment, it was like the room tilted, as if something was sliding into place. It was in that exact stillness that a new figure entered the courtroom. She wore a dark navy suit and carried herself with sharp precision. The seal on her badge identified her as part of the department's Civil Rights Division. I apologize for the interruption, she said, but I have urgent business related to this proceeding. Judge Rourke, though surprised, nodded. You may speak. The woman cleared her throat. We've concluded a preliminary review of the documents submitted by Mr. Gray. Based on those findings, we have initiated a formal inquiry into the conduct of regional officers and the nature of Mr. Ellison's arrest. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Effective immediately, she continued. The charges against Mr. Ellison are under federal reconsideration, and he is no longer under legal obligation to appear for these proceedings. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like something more honest. The judge looked at Micah. Do you wish to make a final statement? Micah stood, slowly. He didn't look around the room. He looked at her. Your Honor, I didn't come to be freed. I came to remind you what freedom means. It doesn't live in paper or policy. It lives in people. All of them, even the quiet ones. He turned to the gallery. And to every person watching, don't wait until someone else carries your truth. Speak it not with hate, not with anger, with courage. As he stepped away from the stand, no one clapped, no one needed to, because in that moment, a courtroom built for judgment had been transformed into something sacred, something rare. It had become a place of listening, and listening changes everything. Asterisk. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon, not with the usual shuffle of shoes or quiet chatter, but with the hush of people carrying something heavier than paperwork, something invisible, but weighty. Not guilt, not shame. Truth. It clung to their clothes, like the scent of rain after a long drought. Something had shifted in that courtroom, and everyone knew it. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the real storm hadn't even begun. Outside, the sky had changed. Not darker, but brighter, like it had been waiting for the exact moment to break open. The news hadn't even reached the airwaves yet, but inside government buildings, phones had already started to ring. Somewhere in Washington, a senior analyst stared at a digital file labeled Public Prayer Incident, reclassified. Beneath that title were names. Too many of them. The system didn't just move slowly, it moved quietly, and sometimes with purpose. But Micah Ellison didn't walk out of that courtroom with a sense of revenge. He walked out with something else. Resolve. He had no intention of disappearing, no desire to fade into the background. He wasn't interested in being a symbol either. What he wanted was to finish what he started. As the sun dipped lower behind the courthouse steps, Ava caught up to him. She'd shed her blazer sleeves, rolled up, eyes tired but alive. "You realize this doesn't end today," she said, half a question, half a warning. Micah smiled faintly. "It was never about today, it was always about tomorrow." Ava nodded. "Then we better get ready, because tomorrow, the world's going to ask who you are." Micah looked out over the city. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a preacher, standing on a pulpit, but something inside him had awakened. He understood now that the power he carried didn't come from defiance. It came from clarity, the quiet kind that speaks with actions instead of noise. That night, the first video clip surfaced online just under 2 minutes long. Someone in the gallery had filmed the moment Elijah Brooks spoke his truth, followed by Micah's closing words, no background music, no subtitles, just voices, real ones. By morning, the video had been viewed 6 million times. The call started next, first from journalists, then schools, then churches, then places he'd never heard of. A radio station in Montana played his speech between gospel tracks. A teacher in Johannesburg wrote an open letter saying she played it in her classroom, and the students stood and clapped. Not because they understood every word, but because they felt it. Micah didn't sleep much that week. He wasn't used to attention, he wasn't chasing it, but people needed more. They weren't asking him to lead protests or hold rallies. They were asking for presence, for someone who reminded them that you could speak without shouting, that you could stand without pushing. That piece wasn't passive, it was brave. Ava worked behind the scenes, quietly helping him build something he didn't have a name for. Yet, not a movement, not a campaign, something simpler, a space, a gathering of people who believe that silence isn't the absence of voice, it's the presence of deep listening. They called it the quiet ground, a name that, in any other time, might have been overlooked, but in this moment, it was perfect. Every Sunday evening, people began showing up. Parks, church basements, city halls, even train stations. They gathered not to protest, but to listen, to each other, to stories, to grief, to hope. And Micah didn't speak at every event. Sometimes he just sat and held hands with strangers. Sometimes he read names. Sometimes he just lit a candle, and through it all, he kept a small envelope folded inside his coat pocket, the same one Judge Rourke had received, but never opened aloud. It was the original complaint document from the Department of Justice, sealed, signed, and dated. But inside, on the back of the last page, someone had written a single sentence in pen, barely visible: "Truth that waits is still truth." He never found out who wrote it. Weeks passed, then months. The attention faded, at least the public kind. The world moved on to other headlines, other crises. But in quiet corners, where people still felt forgotten, the quiet ground grew. It spread like wildflowers, not loud, not flashy, but stubbornly beautiful. People began writing letters, not emails, real letters, stories of their own quiet resistance. A grandmother who refused to leave her neighborhood after her housing was threatened. A young boy who started a library on his block with nothing but donated books. A nurse who sang lullabies in her patients' native languages, just to comfort them when they had no visitors. Micah read every letter. He replied to each one, because he understood something the world often forgets. Change isn't always a moment. Sometimes it's a rhythm, and as long as people keep stepping to that rhythm, one act of quiet courage at a time, then truth would always have a place to stand. It began with a single knock. 3 months after the courtroom fell silent, on a rainy morning where the sky seemed unsure of itself, Micah Ellison stood in the doorway of his modest apartment, staring at a woman holding a notebook and a trembling pen. She wasn't a reporter. She wasn't there for a soundbite. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful, like every word had been rehearsed in the quiet of her own uncertainty. "My name is Lila Jacobs," she said. "I think you knew my father." Micah's hand gripped the doorknob, not out of fear but memory. Lila's last name rang like a bell in a closed room. Her father had been a senior legal advisor during the height of the enforcement directive that led to Micah's original arrest. A man who, according to files never made public, had quietly tried to oppose the move, and paid for it with his career. "I think he wanted to tell the truth," she said, "but never got the chance." Micah stepped aside and welcomed her in, because some doors are more than wood and hinges. Some are moments, turning points. And this one was the start of something he didn't know he'd been waiting for. Lila opened the notebook. Inside were copies of handwritten memos, transcripts, private correspondences, papers that painted a picture clearer than any headline ever could. But that wasn't why she came. She hadn't shown up just to drop a file. She wanted to build something, not a case, not a protest, a record, a preservation of every unheard story left in the wake of the injustice Micah had endured and triumphed over. That afternoon, they sat by the window while the rain tapped gently against the glass, and Lila told him something Micah would never forget. "My father used to say, silence isn't empty. It's full of things that were never said out loud." Those words stayed with Micah. That night, he called Ava. "What if we stopped waiting for people to find our story?" he asked, and started finding theirs. Ava didn't ask for an explanation. She just whispered, "Tell me what you need." They called it the Listening Archive. It wasn't on the news. It wasn't part of a campaign. It was something quieter but deeper. They went town by town, neighborhood by neighborhood, gathering stories from people who never thought their voices mattered. Janitors, war veterans, teachers, foster parents, grocery clerks, single mothers, kids who walked their siblings to school. Each story was recorded, preserved, and shared only with the storyteller's blessing. And each one reminded the world that truth isn't reserved for the powerful. It lives in the ordinary, the invisible, the everyday acts of quiet bravery. Micah didn't tell his story anymore. He let others tell theirs. He became the listener. In one small town, an elderly man brought a crumpled envelope filled with faded photos and sat with Micah for over an hour. He'd been wrongly imprisoned as a young man, back in 1961, never told a soul. But now, 64 years later, he wanted someone to know. Not for justice, for peace. "I kept my silence all this time," the man said, "but it kept me too." Another time, a group of high school students organized a silent walk through their campus, each one holding a sign that read, "I am more than what you see." When they arrived at the gym, one of the students played a clip of Micah's courtroom speech. No shouting, no protest signs, just presence. Something extraordinary had begun to happen. In places where division once ruled, communities began holding quiet gatherings. City halls, church halls, even old barns. People came to listen, to write, to light candles in honor of the silenced. What began as a courtroom battle transformed into a movement built not on noise but attention, on the radical power of being fully present. Micah sometimes stood at the back of the room during these events, hands in his coat pockets, a soft smile on his face. He didn't need to be center stage. His role had evolved. He had become the thread unseen, but holding the fabric together. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the fields of a small southern town, Ava handed him a small box. Inside was a folded piece of parchment. On it, written in the careful penmanship of someone who understood legacy, were these words: "Micah Ellison, for demonstrating that dignity is not in volume, but in presence, awarded the Presidential Medal of Civic Grace." He stared at the parchment, quiet, and then he said the only thing that made sense: "This belongs to all of them. Every voice we heard." He never wore the medal. He framed it, hung it above the door of the Listening Archive, and below it, he placed a plaque that simply read, "Truth speaks. We listen." Years passed, but the ripple never faded, because somewhere, right now, someone is sitting alone, unsure if their voice matters. Somewhere, someone is standing on the edge of a courtroom, a school hallway, a kitchen table, holding back what they really want to say. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember the story of a man who never raised his voice but lifted others instead. And in that moment, they will speak, and someone will listen.